On a bitter winter's day in Manhattan, the streets were filled with a hustle of movement, people wrapped in heavy coats, scarves, and gloves to fend off the sharp wind. Amidst the bustling crowds, there was one man who stood still, his presence almost invisible, yet his eyes told a story of pain, regret, and sacrifice. David Miller, a homeless veteran, sat slumped against the cold, grey stone of a subway station wall, his clothes worn and dirty, his face weathered by the years and the hardships he'd endured. David had once been a proud member of Bravo Company, a unit that had been deployed to Afghanistan and fought bravely through harrowing experiences. But after returning from the war, he found himself in a world that seemed indifferent to the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made. His once promising future had crumbled in the face of PTSD, the difficulties of reintegration into civilian life, and a sense of disconnection from society. His struggles had led him to the streets of Manhattan, where he now spent his days begging for scraps and his nights alone, haunted by the memories of war. The wind that day was particularly harsh, cutting through the city like a knife. David pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to shield himself from the cold, but it didn't help much. His hands, numb from the chill, clutched a faded military jacket, the insignia of his unit barely visible beneath the dirt and grime that had built up over the years. For a moment he closed his eyes and let the noise of the city wash over him, lost in thoughts of the past. He remembered the faces of the friends he had lost in combat, the way they had laughed together one moment, and then in the blink of an eye, they were gone. He could still hear the explosions, the gunfire, the cries of those who never made it back home. He could still feel the weight of their deaths pressing on him. But what was even harder to bear was the silence that followed, the silence that greeted him when he returned home, the empty streets, the lack of recognition for his service, the cold indifference of a society that seemed to have moved on, forgetting the sacrifices of men and women like him. As he sat there, feeling invisible, David barely noticed the man who walked towards him through the crowd. At first, it was just another person, wrapped in a thick coat, moving quickly through the city. But then, the figure stopped in front of David, blocking his view of the passing pedestrians. David looked up, squinting against the sunlight, trying to make out the figure's face. It was Donald Trump. The former president, well known for his wealth, fame, and larger-than-life persona, stood before David, looking down at him with an expression that was neither pitying nor indifferent, but simply curious. Trump had been in Manhattan for a business meeting, but something in the way David sat caught his attention. The look of resignation on the veteran's face, the air of abandonment, stirred something in Trump that he couldn't ignore. "Hey, how's it going?" Trump's voice was surprisingly soft, not the brash, commanding tone he often used in public speeches, but a calm, almost concerned tone that seemed out of place for a man used to commanding the room. David, startled, looked up at the man. For a moment he didn't recognize him, not in his current state. He had never been one to follow politics closely, and the sight of Trump in front of him was more of a curiosity than anything else. "I'm fine," David replied quietly, his voice hoarse from lack of food and water. "Just trying to get by." Trump took a moment to study David, his eyes scanning the homeless man's face, taking in the lines of pain, the hollow eyes that had seen too much. There was something in David's gaze that made Trump pause. The veteran wasn't just another man on the street, begging for change. He was someone who had given everything for his country, and now he was forgotten, left to suffer in silence. "You served, didn't you?" Trump asked, his voice filled with recognition. David nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "I was in Bravo Company. We were deployed to Afghanistan. I've seen things I can't forget." Trump sat down beside him, not in a grand gesture, but in a way that made it clear he wasn't just passing through. He sat there, next to a man who had seen the worst of war and who was now struggling in the cold streets of New York. David was caught off guard by this unexpected attention, but he didn't pull away. Something about the moment felt different. "Tell me your story, David," Trump said quietly. "Tell me what happened." David hesitated for a moment, but then, feeling that there was no one else around to listen, he began to speak. His words came out in a slow, fractured rhythm, each sentence heavier than the last. He spoke of the horror of combat, the loss of his brothers in arms, and the difficulty of coming back to a world that didn't seem to understand. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the nightmares, the isolation. The words tumbled out, raw and painful. Trump listened intently, his expression serious, his usual bravado replaced with something more genuine. He nodded as David spoke, as if he truly understood. When David finished, there was a long silence between them. Trump leaned back slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "You've done more for this country than most people will ever know, David," Trump said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I'm sorry that you've been forgotten, but I promise you, I won't let you go through this alone. You don't deserve to be left behind." David looked at Trump, not sure if he believed him. He had heard promises before, but they had always fallen flat. Yet there was something about Trump's words that felt different. This man, who had been the leader of the free world, was taking time out of his busy life to sit with him, a homeless veteran, and listen to his story. It wasn't just a fleeting moment, it felt like something more. "I'll make sure you get the help you need," Trump continued. "I'm not just talking about a handout. I want to make sure veterans like you are never forgotten again." True to his word, Trump made arrangements for David to receive medical care, both physical and psychological. But he didn't stop there. Trump understood that David's story wasn't unique. There were countless other veterans struggling just like him. And so he decided to take action. A few months later, in a grand ceremony at the White House, David Miller was honored alongside his fellow soldiers from Bravo Company. The room was filled with applause as the veterans walked in, their service recognized and celebrated. For the first time in years, David felt seen, valued, and appreciated. Trump stood at the podium, his voice filled with emotion as he praised the veterans for their sacrifices. But he didn't stop there. He announced the establishment of a support fund for homeless veterans, a fund that would provide financial assistance, health care, and job training for those who had fallen through the cracks. The fund would also focus on raising awareness about the mental health challenges many veterans faced, from PTSD to depression, and provide resources for their families. David, once a forgotten soldier on the streets of Manhattan, now stood before a room full of people, recognized not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of hope and resilience. His transformation was nothing short of miraculous. He had gone from a homeless man living in the shadows to a beacon of strength for veterans across the country. In the months that followed, David's life continued to change. He found purpose again, traveling the country to speak about the struggles of veterans and advocating for their needs. He became a voice for the voiceless, using his platform to bring attention to the issues facing veterans and to ensure that they received the recognition and support they deserved. David Miller's story had become a national movement, a reminder that no soldier should ever be forgotten. Thanks to the kindness of one man, Donald Trump, David had found his way back from the depths of despair and into a new life, one where he could stand tall again, proud of his service and hopeful for the future. It was a moment of transformation, not just for David, but for every veteran who had ever felt alone, forgotten, and invisible. It proved that with a little kindness, a little recognition, and a lot of heart, lives could be. And for David Miller, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would never again be the forgotten soldier. If you enjoyed the story and found it meaningful, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps us reach more people. We'd also love to hear from you. Share your thoughts and the lessons you've learned in the comments below. Your insights could inspire someone else.